Off the coast of Georgia lies a barrier island that changed the course of American history. Jekyll Island, with its pristine beaches and ancient oaks, looks like a peaceful coastal retreat. But for 25 years, from 1886 to 1942, this island was the most exclusive private club in America, a playground for the wealthiest men in the country, including Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Morgans, and Pulitzers. And in November 1910, this island became the birthplace of one of the most consequential financial systems in world history. In a secret meeting lasting 9 days, a handful of bankers representing 1/4 of the world's wealth designed the Federal Reserve System, America's central bank, the institution that would control the nation's money supply for the next century. This is the story of how America's financial system was created not by elected representatives or government officials, but by private bankers meeting in secret at an exclusive club. It's the story of how those bankers designed a system to protect their own interests while presenting it as serving the public good. And it's the story of an island that became the symbol of financial oligarchy, where the rules that governed everyone else didn't apply, where the wealthiest men in America could gather without scrutiny, and where the future of American finance was decided behind closed doors. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. To understand Jekyll Island, you first need to understand the world of American finance in the late 1800s. There was no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no coordinated monetary policy. Instead, there were thousands of banks, each issuing their own currency, each operating independently, each vulnerable to runs and panics. Financial crises were frequent and devastating. The Panic of 1873 caused a depression that lasted 6 years. The Panic of 1893 saw over 500 banks fail and unemployment reached 20%. These crises destroyed ordinary people, their savings wiped out, their jobs lost, their farms foreclosed. But for the biggest bankers, crises were opportunities. When smaller banks failed, bigger banks could buy them for pennies on the dollar. When businesses went bankrupt, wealthy financiers could acquire valuable assets cheaply. Financial instability was terrible for workers and small businesses, but it was profitable for those with enough capital to weather the storm and buy up distressed assets. This was the world that men like J.P. Morgan, George F. Baker, and James Stillman dominated. They weren't just bankers, they were the financial system. Between them, they controlled the 3 largest banks in New York, which meant they controlled a massive portion of America's capital. They decided which businesses got loans and which didn't. They decided which regions developed and which stagnated. They decided who succeeded and who failed. And they liked this system. It gave them enormous power with minimal oversight. They answered to shareholders and themselves, not to government regulators or the public. The chaos of frequent financial panics was a small price to pay for absolute control. But by the early 1900s, this system was becoming untenable. The panics were getting worse, the public was getting angrier, and progressive-era politicians were calling for banking reform. Something had to change. The question was, would that change break the bankers' power, or would it consolidate it? Jekyll Island, meanwhile, had been purchased in 1886 by a group of millionaires led by men with names like Rockefeller, Morgan, Vanderbilt, and Pulitzer. They paid $125,000 for the entire island, about $4 million in today's money, which was cheap even then. The plan was to create the most exclusive club in America, a retreat where the wealthiest men and their families could vacation away from public scrutiny. The Jekyll Island Club opened in 1888 with a membership limited to 100 families. These weren't just wealthy people. They were the wealthiest people in the world. At the club's peak, the collective wealth of its members was estimated at 1/6 of the world's total wealth. A single room at the club's meetings represented more economic power than most governments. The island was transformed into a paradise for the ultra-rich. The clubhouse was a sprawling Queen Anne-style structure with 60 guest rooms. Members built cottages, which were actually mansions of 15 to 20 rooms each. There were stables, tennis courts, a golf course, and miles of private beach. Everything was maintained by black workers who lived in segregated quarters and were paid poverty wages to serve millionaires. But the real luxury of Jekyll Island wasn't the amenities. It was the privacy. The club was accessible only by boat, and visitors had to be personally invited by members. No reporters, no photographers, no uninvited guests. What happened on Jekyll Island stayed on Jekyll Island. For men like George F. Baker, president of First National Bank, this privacy was invaluable. Baker was one of the most powerful bankers in America, but remained intensely private, refusing interviews and avoiding publicity. Jekyll Island offered him and others like him a place to conduct business, make deals, and discuss strategy away from public scrutiny. And in November 1910, that privacy would be used to redesign America's entire financial system. The Panic of 1907 was the crisis that finally forced action on banking reform. In October 1907, a failed attempt to corner the copper market led to a run on banks. Panic spread through the financial system. Banks failed across the country. The stock market crashed. The economy plunged into recession. There was no central bank to provide liquidity or stabilize the system. The U.S. Treasury tried to help, but lacked the resources and authority to stop the panic. The entire financial system was on the verge of collapse. J.P. Morgan, then 70 years old, essentially became America's central bank. He gathered the most powerful bankers in his library and forced them to coordinate a rescue. He organized loans to struggling institutions, convinced banks to support each other, and used his personal fortune and credibility to stop the panic. It worked, but barely. The Panic of 1907 revealed how fragile the American financial system was and how dependent on the goodwill of a few powerful bankers. Critics asked, why should one private citizen have to save the entire economy? What if Morgan had refused? What if he had been out of the country or had decided to profit from the panic instead? The public demanded reform. Progressive politicians called for government control of banking. William Jennings Bryan and other populists argued that private bankers had too much power and that money should be controlled by elected officials for the public good. The banking elite faced a choice: accept government control of finance, or create a system that appeared to be government control while actually preserving and expanding their power. They chose the latter, and they chose to design that system in secret at Jekyll Island. In November 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich boarded his private rail car in New York. Aldrich was one of the most powerful politicians in America, chairman of the National Monetary Commission, and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller Jr. He was also completely in the pocket of the banking industry. With Aldrich were 6 other men, traveling under assumed names to avoid press attention. A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. Frank Vanderlip, President of National City Bank, now Citibank. Henry Davison, Senior Partner at J.P. Morgan and Company. Charles Norton, President of First National Bank of New York. Benjamin Strong, Head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust. Paul Warburg, Partner at Kuhn, Loeb and Company and representative of the Rothschild banking interests. This group represented the absolute pinnacle of American and international banking. J.P. Morgan himself didn't attend. He was too famous, and his presence would have attracted attention. But his interests were represented by Davison and Strong. George F. Baker, president of First National Bank, also didn't attend personally, but was represented by Norton. The 7 men traveled to Jekyll Island undercover stories. They told people they were going duck hunting. They used only first names, so club servants wouldn't realize who they were. They worked in absolute secrecy for 9 days, from November 20th to 30th, 1910. Their mission: design a central banking system for the United States that would appear to be government-controlled, but would actually be run by private bankers. The Jekyll Island meeting was one of the most consequential secret gatherings in American history. The men who attended it later admitted what happened. Frank Vanderlip wrote about it in his autobiography, and Paul Warburg discussed it in his memoirs. But they only revealed the truth after the Federal Reserve had been established, and it was too late to stop it. For 9 days, these bankers worked on crafting legislation that would create a central bank, but call it a Federal Reserve System, to make it sound governmental. Give private banks control of the system while making it appear to be public. Allow the banking industry to create money and control its supply. Protect large banks from competition by smaller banks. Make taxpayers responsible for bank failures while keeping profits private. Prevent future banking panics. not by making banks safer, but by ensuring they could always get bailouts. The system they designed was brilliant in its deception. The Federal Reserve would have 12 regional banks, making it appear decentralized and democratic. But control would be vested in a board of governors appointed by the president, and those governors would inevitably come from and represent the banking industry. The regional Federal Reserve banks would be owned by private banks, which would receive dividends on their ownership stakes. This meant private banks would literally own and profit from America's central bank. But the structure would be complex enough that most people wouldn't understand it. Most importantly, the Federal Reserve would have the power to create money, to expand or contract the money supply through interest rates and bond purchases. This is an extraordinary power, essentially giving private bankers the ability to control the economy. But it would be presented as necessary to maintain financial stability. The men at Jekyll Island didn't create this system to serve the public interest. They created it to serve their own interests. And they did so in secret because they knew the public would never accept it if they understood what was really being created. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. After 9 days on Jekyll Island, the men returned to their normal lives. Senator Aldrich introduced their proposal as the Aldrich Plan in 1912. It was immediately opposed by progressive politicians who saw it for what it was, a banker's scheme to consolidate power. William Jennings Bryan denounced it as putting the nation's credit in the hands of private banks. Louis Brandeis, later a Supreme Court justice, wrote scathingly about how the plan would create a money trust more powerful than any existing monopoly. Progressive Republicans like Robert La Follette fought against it in the Senate. The Aldrich Plan failed. The banking interests had overplayed their hand by having a senator closely associated with Wall Street introduce it. The public didn't trust anything that came from Aldrich and the banks. But the Jekyll Island Group didn't give up. They repackaged their plan with a new name and a new political champion. In 1913, Representative Carter Glass and Senator Robert Owen introduced the Federal Reserve Act, which was essentially the Jekyll Island Plan with modifications to make it appear more populist. The key difference was marketing. Instead of admitting it was designed by bankers, they presented it as a government reform to control bankers. Instead of emphasizing banker control, they emphasized government oversight. Instead of one central bank, which Americans had historically opposed, they emphasized the 12 regional banks. Woodrow Wilson, elected president in 1912, supported the plan. Wilson presented himself as a progressive reformer, taking on the banking trusts. In reality, his campaign had been heavily financed by the same banking interests that had met at Jekyll Island. His chief advisor was Colonel Edward House, who was closely connected to the banking elite. The Federal Reserve Act passed on December 23, 1913, late at night, with many congressmen already home for Christmas with minimal debate, and with most members having no real understanding of what they were voting for. It was signed into law by President Wilson the same day. The Jekyll Island Plan, designed in secret by private bankers, had become law, and most Americans had no idea what had been done to them. The immediate consequences of the Federal Reserve weren't dramatic. It took time for the system to be fully implemented. But within a few years, the impact became clear. The Federal Reserve helped finance America's entry into World War I by buying government bonds, effectively printing money to fund the war. This was exactly what the Jekyll Island Group had intended. A central bank could finance government spending without raising taxes, making wars and government expansion much easier. After the war, the Federal Reserve's monetary policy contributed to the boom of the 1920s and the subsequent bust. In the late 1920s, the Fed kept interest rates low, fueling speculation and the stock market bubble. When the bubble burst in 1929, the Fed's response was to contract the money supply dramatically, turning a stock market crash into the Great Depression. Between 1929 and 1933, the money supply contracted by 1/3. Banks failed by the thousands. Unemployment reached 25%. It was the worst economic disaster in American history, and the Federal Reserve, the institution supposedly created to prevent such disasters, had caused it through disastrous monetary policy. But here's the crucial point. While ordinary Americans suffered through the Depression, The banking elite who had designed the Federal Reserve maintained their power and wealth. Large banks like J.P. Morgan and National City Bank survived. They bought failed smaller banks. They acquired assets for pennies on the dollar. The Depression consolidated banking power in exactly the way the Jekyll Island Group had intended. George F. Baker, by then in his 90s, saw his first national bank merge with National City Bank to create what would become Citibank, one of the largest banks in the world. The Jekyll Island system had worked exactly as designed. It protected large banks while allowing smaller banks and ordinary people to fail. Jekyll Island Club itself continued as a playground for the ultra-wealthy through the 1920s and 30s. But its exclusivity and opulence became increasingly problematic as the Depression devastated ordinary Americans. The contrast was stark. On Jekyll Island, millionaires played golf and dined on elaborate meals, while on the mainland, Americans stood in bread lines. The club represented everything that was wrong with American capitalism: extreme wealth inequality, power concentrated in few hands, elites who lived by different rules than everyone else. The club's members included not just bankers, but industrialists whose business practices were destroying workers' lives. There were factory owners who paid starvation wages, railroad barons who crushed unions, industrialists whose plants polluted communities. They would all gather at Jekyll Island, in their private paradise, far from the suffering their business practices created. The black workers who maintained Jekyll Island were paid approximately $20 per month, around $400 in today's money, to work long hours, serving people whose wealth they couldn't comprehend. They lived in segregated quarters, used separate facilities, and were expected to be invisible except when serving. This was the reality of Jekyll Island, a paradise built on exploitation, maintained by underpaid black labor, serving people who had designed a financial system to benefit themselves at everyone else's expense. As World War II approached, Jekyll Island Club's days were numbered. The war made the club's elitism and excess look obscene. Gasoline rationing made travel to the island difficult. Labor shortages made it hard to maintain. And the club's wealthy members had other concerns as the world burned. In 1942, the club closed. The members claimed it was temporary due to wartime conditions. But it never reopened as a private club. In 1947, the state of Georgia purchased Jekyll Island for $675,000 and turned it into a state park. This was presented as democratization, the exclusive playground of millionaires open to ordinary people. But by then, the damage was done. The Federal Reserve System designed at Jekyll Island in 1910 had been operating for 30 years, had helped cause the Great Depression, and was now permanently embedded in American finance. The physical club was dissolved, but the financial system it had birthed continued. The Jekyll Island Club became a historical curiosity. The Federal Reserve became an unquestioned institution. Today, you can visit Jekyll Island and tour the historic club buildings. You can see the mansions where millionaires vacationed. You can walk the beaches where the wealthiest families in America once played. You can even stay in the restored clubhouse, now a luxury hotel. But what you won't find is any serious acknowledgement of the 1910 meeting and what it really meant. The official tours mention it. The Federal Reserve was designed here, but they don't explain the secrecy, the deception, the fact that private bankers designed a system to benefit themselves and lied to the public about it. Instead, the Federal Reserve is presented as a necessary institution, a reform that modernized American banking, a solution to financial instability. The dark reality, that it was designed by bankers to serve bankers, is glossed over or ignored entirely. The Federal Reserve's track record since 1913 has been mixed at best, disastrous at worst. It helped cause the Great Depression through catastrophic monetary policy. It kept interest rates artificially low in the 2000s, fueling the housing bubble. It bailed out Wall Street banks after the 2008 crisis with trillions in loans while ordinary Americans lost homes. It has consistently prioritized protecting large banks over helping ordinary people. It operates with minimal oversight and accountability. Its policies have contributed to massive wealth inequality. But the Fed is also defended as necessary and inevitable. The argument goes, modern economies need central banks. Financial systems require coordination. Someone has to manage the money supply. This is true, but it doesn't mean that private bankers should control that system. The Jekyll Island Group didn't create the Federal Reserve because central banking was inevitable. They created it because they wanted private control of money creation. They designed a system where taxpayers bear the risks, backing bank deposits, funding bailouts, while private banks keep the profits. This is the core insight of the Jekyll Island story. The Federal Reserve isn't a government institution that regulates banks. It's a banker's institution that uses government power to serve banking interests. It was designed that way, deliberately, by bankers meeting in secret. And when you understand this, the Fed's behavior makes perfect sense. It bails out Wall Street because it was created by Wall Street. It prioritizes financial markets over workers because that's what its designers intended. It operates in secrecy because secrecy is how it was created. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. George F. Baker, whose bank's interests were represented at the Jekyll Island meeting, lived to see the Federal Reserve fully established. He died in 1931 at age 91, one of the richest men in America, having successfully protected and expanded his banking empire through the creation of the Fed. Baker had been a ruthless financier, a member of J.P. Morgan's inner circle, a man who had helped create monopolies and trusts across American industry. The Federal Reserve was his final triumph, a monopoly on money itself, controlled by private bankers, protected by government power. He died in his mansion on Park Avenue, surrounded by art and luxury, never having faced consequences for the system he helped create. He was eulogized as a financial genius, a captain of industry, a pillar of American capitalism. The fact that he had helped design a system that would contribute to the Great Depression was never mentioned. The other Jekyll Island attendees met similar fates. They died wealthy, powerful, and respected. Paul Warburg received the Distinguished Service Medal from the government for his work creating the Federal Reserve. Frank Vanderlip became a celebrated banker and author. Benjamin Strong, as head of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, became one of the most powerful financial officials in America. None of them faced accountability for designing a system in secret, lying about it to the public, and structuring it to benefit private banks at public expense. They won. Completely and totally, they won. The question that haunts the Jekyll Island story is, what would American finance look like if the 1910 meeting had never happened? What if banking reform had been designed by elected officials focused on public interest, rather than by private bankers focused on their own profit? We'll never know. But we can look at what we have. A Federal Reserve that has presided over multiple financial crises, that bailed out the banks that caused the 2008 crash while ordinary people lost homes, that keeps interest rates artificially low to prop up asset prices while savers get nothing, that has contributed to wealth inequality reaching levels not seen since the Gilded Age. This is what the Jekyll Island Group created. Not a system to serve the public good, but a system to serve banking interests while maintaining the appearance of government oversight. It was a brilliant con. Design a private banking system, make it look governmental, and then claim that any criticism is an attack on a necessary public institution. And it worked. For over a century, the Federal Reserve has operated largely as the Jekyll Island Group intended, with minimal real accountability, serving financial interests while claiming to serve the public interest. Jekyll Island today is a pleasant state park. Families vacation there. People play golf, swim in the ocean, and tour the historic club buildings. It's a nice place, peaceful and scenic, with a fascinating history of Gilded Age wealth. But underneath that pleasant surface is a darker story. This is the island where America's financial system was designed in secret by private bankers. This is where a handful of men, representing an infinitesimally small fraction of the population, decided how money would work for everyone else. This is where the rules were written to benefit the rule writers. The physical structures of Jekyll Island Club have been preserved and restored. The mansions are museums. The clubhouse is a hotel. The grounds are beautifully maintained. But the real legacy of Jekyll Island isn't the buildings. It's the financial system that was created here. And that system is still very much alive, still serving the interests it was designed to serve, still operating with the secrecy it was created in. The Federal Reserve is more powerful now than the Jekyll Island Group could have imagined, with the ability to create trillions of dollars with a few keystrokes, with influence over the global economy, with minimal oversight or accountability. This is what private control of public institutions looks like. This is what happens when banking interests design banking policy. This is the legacy of Jekyll Island, a beautiful island that birthed an ugly system, a pleasant park that masks a dark history, a symbol of how American democracy can be subverted by concentrated wealth. The dark story of Jekyll Island isn't just historical, it's ongoing. The same dynamics that led to the 1910 meeting are still at work today. Banks still have enormous political influence through campaign contributions and lobbying. Financial regulators are often drawn from and return to the banking industry, the revolving door. Complex financial regulations are written by those they supposedly regulate. Financial crises still result in bailouts for banks, but austerity for everyone else. The Federal Reserve still prioritizes financial markets over workers and communities. The methods have been refined, the structures have grown more complex, but the fundamental reality remains. Financial policy in America is designed primarily to serve financial interests. The public good, when considered at all, is secondary. This is the lasting legacy of Jekyll Island. Not just the Federal Reserve itself, but the model of how concentrated wealth can shape policy behind closed doors, how private interests can capture public institutions, how systems can be designed to appear democratic while actually serving oligarchic interests. There's a particular irony in Jekyll Island's current status as a public park. The island that was once accessible only to the wealthiest families in America is now open to everyone. You can walk the same beaches where Rockefellers and Morgans vacationed. You can tour the same buildings where millionaires schemed. But while physical access has been democratized, financial access hasn't. The system designed on Jekyll Island still serves the wealthy over everyone else. You can vacation on the island, but you can't get a seat at the Federal Reserve Board. You can tour the clubhouse, but you can't influence monetary policy. You can walk the grounds, but you don't control the money supply. The democratization of Jekyll Island is a symbol without substance. The real power, the financial power, remains concentrated in hands just as few as those that gathered here in 1910. The names have changed, the institutions have evolved, but the fundamental dynamic of wealth controlling the financial system remains. If you visit Jekyll Island today and take the historical tour, listen carefully to how the 1910 meeting is described. It's usually presented as historical trivia, an interesting footnote. Did you know the Federal Reserve was designed here? What's left unsaid is that it was designed in secret by private bankers to serve their interests. What's omitted is that they lied about it for years. What's glossed over is that they created a system that has consistently prioritized financial markets over ordinary people. The official narrative makes it sound benign, even necessary. America needed a central bank, and these financial experts designed one. The darker reality, that private bankers hijacked banking reform to consolidate their own power, doesn't fit the tourist-friendly narrative. This sanitization of history is itself part of Jekyll Island's dark legacy. The powerful get to write their own history, to present their self-serving actions as public service, to bury uncomfortable truths under generations of myth-making and propaganda. The Federal Reserve is presented in textbooks as a government institution, a necessary component of modern finance. The fact that it was literally designed by private bankers at a private club on a private island is treated as a relevant detail rather than the defining fact about its nature and purpose. The men who met at Jekyll Island in 1910 understood something fundamental about power. It's easier to maintain if people don't realize you have it. By creating a system that appeared to be governmental while actually being controlled by bankers, they ensured minimal resistance to banker power. If the Federal Reserve had been openly and honestly presented as a private banking consortium with government backing, the public would have rejected it. So instead, it was presented as a government reform to control banks, with private banker control hidden in complex organizational structures. This is the real lesson of Jekyll Island. Sophisticated power doesn't announce itself. It hides behind complexity, behind seemingly democratic structures, behind claims of public service. The Jekyll Island Group didn't try to defend banker power. They disguised it as government reform. And it worked spectacularly. To this day, Most Americans think the Federal Reserve is a government agency. They don't realize it's owned by private banks. They don't know it was designed by bankers to serve banking interests. They don't understand that Federal and Federal Reserve is marketing, not reality. George F. Baker's role in the Jekyll Island story is representative of the entire banking elite of his era. He was extraordinarily powerful, but deliberately remained out of public view. He gave no interviews, made no speeches, and carefully cultivated an image of boring competence rather than dramatic power. This was strategic. Baker understood that high-profile tycoons like Rockefeller attracted criticism and reform efforts. Better to wield power quietly, to be unknown to the general public, to hide in plain sight while controlling vast financial resources. The Jekyll Island meeting was perfect for men like Baker, powerful people making important decisions in complete secrecy, with no accountability to the public affected by those decisions. They didn't need to convince the public their plan was good. They just needed to convince politicians and then implement the plan before people understood what was happening. Baker's bank, First National, eventually merged with National City Bank to create what became Citibank. That merger happened because the Federal Reserve System protected large banks and allowed them to consolidate. The system Baker helped design at Jekyll Island directly benefited his bank, exactly as intended. He died having successfully reshaped American finance to benefit himself and his fellow bankers. And he did it so quietly that most Americans didn't even know his name. The tragedy of Jekyll Island isn't that powerful bankers created a central bank. It's that they created one designed primarily to serve themselves while claiming to serve the public. If America needed banking reform, and it probably did, that reform should have been designed by people representing diverse interests, operating in public, with democratic accountability. Instead, it was designed by a handful of bankers, meeting in secret on a private island, with no public input or oversight. And then they lied about it, presenting the Federal Reserve as a government reform rather than a banker's coup. This matters because the design of institutions shapes their behavior. An institution designed by and for bankers will serve banking interests. An institution created in secrecy will operate in secrecy. An institution structured to avoid accountability will avoid accountability. The Federal Reserve does all of these things because it was designed to do them. The Jekyll Island meeting wasn't an aberration. It was the origin story, the founding moment that established the Fed's fundamental nature and purpose. Today, Jekyll Island sits peacefully off the Georgia coast. The club buildings have been restored. The island is accessible by causeway. Families vacation there, unaware of or indifferent to the dark financial history created on this pleasant barrier island. But that history matters. It matters because the system designed here still governs how money works in America. It matters because the same dynamics of private wealth controlling public policy are still at work. It matters because understanding how we got here helps us understand where we are. The Federal Reserve has become so embedded in American finance that imagining an alternative seems impossible. But it is an alternative, one of many possible ways to organize a financial system. And it's an alternative designed by and for private bankers at a secret meeting on a private island. That's not a conspiracy theory. It's historical fact, admitted by the participants, documented in their memoirs and correspondence. The conspiracy wasn't that the Jekyll Island meeting happened. It's that for decades, the participants denied it happened and denied what they had created. If this story made you pause or rethink something, help it reach someone else who should hear it too. A like, a subscription, or a thoughtful comment helps this video travel further and keeps these stories alive. The dark story of Jekyll Island is ultimately a story about democracy and plutocracy. Can ordinary people govern themselves? Or will concentrated wealth always find ways to control the rules? Can public institutions serve public interests? Or will private interests inevitably capture them? The Jekyll Island meeting suggests pessimistic answers to those questions. When banking reform was needed, bankers designed a reform. When the system was restructured, it was restructured to benefit those already at the top. When institutions were created to regulate finance, they were created by financiers. This is how plutocracy works in a democracy, not through open dictatorship, but through capture of democratic institutions. You don't abolish elections, You fund candidates. You don't oppose regulation. You write the regulations. You don't reject reform. You design the reform to serve your interests. Jekyll Island Club is gone, replaced by a public park. But the system created there remains, more powerful than ever. The buildings are museums, but the Federal Reserve is still very much alive, still operating according to the priorities established by the bankers who designed it in secret over a century ago. That's the dark legacy, a beautiful island that birthed an ugly system, a private club that designed public policy, a secret meeting that shaped how money works for everyone. The club has closed, but what it created endures, a reminder that in America, wealth doesn't just buy luxury yachts and mansions. It buys the power to write the rules everyone else has to follow.